Okay, so get ready because we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today. The question of peace in Ukraine.
Yeah.
We've got a whole bunch of articles here, news analysis, expert opinions, all sorts of things.
Right.
We're really going to try to get a handle on what the incoming president is up against as he tries to, well, broker some kind of peace deal in this. It's a mess.
It's a very complicated situation.
And yes, it's incredibly complex.
And to add to that complexity, there's a potential shift happening in U.S. policy. One article even called it a departure from the previous administration's kind of hands-off approach.
Yeah, that piece from Responsible Statecraft really jumped out at me. They argue that by sort of deferring to Ukraine on when and how to negotiate the previous administration might have actually, I don't know, maybe inadvertently prolonged the conflict. Like they incentivized Ukraine to keep fighting, and that's drawn the U.S. in even deeper.
Right. It's an interesting point. It raises the question of, could a more assertive role from the U.S. in pushing for negotiations, could that actually be a good thing?
It's a tough question.
It is.
Especially with this new administration. They're really all about America first when it comes to these peace talks. What does that even mean in this situation?
Well, this Responsible Statecraft article suggests that it means putting U.S. national interests front and center. Things like establishing a balance of power in Europe that would really discourage Russia from, any kind of aggression in the future.
Right. So it's not about abandoning Ukraine. It's about taking a broader view.
Exactly.
If the U.S. can help create a more stable Europe, wouldn't that be good for Ukraine in the long run?
That's the argument. Yeah. The idea is to build a European security structure that benefits everyone, Western interests and Ukraine's interests.
This whole America First approach, it's really something to think about.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we should be supporting Ukraine's right to determine its own future.
Of course.
But on the other hand, maybe this strong U.S. leadership role is what's needed for a lasting peace.
It's tough.
What do you think? It's a tough one.
It really is. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The war in Ukraine isn't just some isolated regional conflict.
Right.
It's a major flashpoint in this global rivalry between Russia and the West.
Yeah, a lot of these articles are really hammering that point home.
Yeah.
They're saying that Russia's main goal is to keep Ukraine out of NATO and block any U.S. military presence in the country.
Right. But it goes deeper than that. Russia is also worried about the bigger picture, NATO expansion, the deployment of U.S. missiles in Europe, things like that.
So understanding these broader concerns that Russia has,
yeah,
could that give the U.S. some leverage in the negotiations?
Potentially.
I mean, if we can figure out a way to address Russia's security concerns and at the same time ensure Ukraine's security and independence, well, that could be a path to peace.
It could, but it's a big if.
Yeah.
And there's another big factor to consider, China.
Yes, China. They're kind of playing both sides, aren't they?
It seems that way. They're sympathetic to Russia's worries about NATO, but they're not exactly happy about the idea of a Russian victory either.
Right.
It's a delicate balance for them.
It is. Yeah. So what are these articles saying about China's role?
Well, one of the most interesting ideas is that the U.S. could actually use this to their advantage.
Okay. Wow.
Well, imagine this. The U.S. invites China to participate in the peace talks. That would put a lot of pressure on Russia to come to the table.
I see.
And it might even give China an incentive to, help make sure any agreement actually holds up.
Right. And what about rebuilding Ukraine after the war?
Yeah, that's another area where China could play a major role.
That's true.
Which would give Russia even more reason to stick to the terms of any agreement.
It's like this giant geopolitical chess game.
It really is. But while we're focused on the international scene, it's also important to look inward.
What do you mean?
Well, several of these articles point out that there are some serious systemic issues within the U.S. foreign policy establishment itself. And these issues may have even played a part in creating this whole crisis.
That Quincy Institute piece is pretty direct about that.
It is.
They criticize this tendency in Washington to prioritize military spending and, war fighting over diplomacy and conflict prevention.
Right. Like we're always reaching for the hammer, even when we need a screwdriver.
Exactly. And then there's that article about firing U.S. generals. They argue that the whole system for selecting our top military leaders, it might be flawed.
It's a provocative argument.
It is. They say the system rewards ambition and political maneuvering more than, actual competence on the battlefield. So that leads us to a pretty uncomfortable question.
What's that?
If the U.S. really wants to deal effectively with challenges from Russia and other rivals, do we need to make some serious changes within our own government?
That's the big question, and it's one we'll have to explore further as we continue our deep dive into these sources.
Definitely. It's easy to get lost in all the geopolitical stuff, but what really stood out to me in these articles is the human cost of this whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. Behind all the talk of strategy and, negotiations, there are real people whose lives have been completely turned upside down by this war.
It's heartbreaking. And it makes you think, if the U.S. is really serious about peace, shouldn't we be looking for solutions that address the root causes?
Yeah.
Not just putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms.
Exactly. And that goes back to that Quincy Institute piece we were talking about.
Yeah.
They really challenge the way things are usually done in Washington. They suggest that maybe our reliance on military solutions, maybe that's part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
What if we focus more on diplomacy, conflict resolution, and really tackling those underlying issues that lead to these kinds of conflicts?
It's like we're so busy playing whack-a-mole with these global crises that we never stop and ask ourselves why the moles keep popping up in the first place.
That's a great way to put it. And it ties into this whole idea of systemic issues within, the U.S. foreign policy establishment, like that article about firing U.S. generals. They argued that the way we choose our top military leaders, it might actually be incentivizing the wrong things. Maybe we're promoting people who are good at climbing the career ladder, but not necessarily the best at strategic thinking or diplomacy.
So you're saying that part of the solution might be reforming our own institutions?
It's a radical idea, but yeah, think about it. If we want to create a more peaceful world, we have to make sure our own house is in order. If we're always reacting to crises instead of preventing them, we're always going to be one step behind.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's get back to Ukraine for a minute. What would a successful peace agreement even look like in this situation?
Well, first of all, it has to address the security concerns of all the parties involved. That means recognizing Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation, with its own borders and its own choices. But it also means acknowledging that Russia has legitimate security interests in the region.
So it's about finding a balance where everyone feels like their concerns are being heard.
Exactly. It's not about appeasing Russia or ignoring Ukraine's needs. It's about finding a solution that provides security guarantees for everyone.
What about this idea of a neutral Ukraine? Some people have suggested that as a way to address Russia's concerns about NATO expansion.
Yeah, that's definitely an option worth considering. A neutral Ukraine with strong international guarantees of its security and independence, that could be a way to de-escalate the situation, but it would require a serious commitment from the international community. We'd need to see strong security guarantees and massive economic support to help Ukraine rebuild after, this devastating war.
And we can't forget about all the people who've been displaced by the conflict.
Right.
Any peace agreement has to address the humanitarian crisis and the need for accountability and, some kind of reconciliation. We can't just pretend the trauma and the injustices never happened.
Absolutely. A real peace agreement isn't just about ending the fighting. It's about creating the conditions for a lasting and just peace. A peace that addresses the root causes of the conflict and helps prevent future violence.
It all seems so incredibly complex.
It is complex, but that's the nature of these global challenges. The good news is that people are having these conversations, they're wrestling with these tough questions, and they're searching for solutions. And that's a sign of hope, even in the midst of all this turmoil.
Reading these articles and having this conversation, it's clear to me that peace is possible, but it's going to take a massive effort from everyone. It requires a willingness to engage with the complexity of the situation, to challenge our own assumptions, and to find solutions that work for all sides.
It's a tall order, but the potential payoff is huge. A more peaceful, just, and secure world for everyone. And that's a goal worth striving for.
It's so easy to get bogged down in all the details of geopolitics and peace talks and everything. But I think one of the things that really hit me when reading these articles was just how much they all focus on the human side of it.
Absolutely. I mean, we're not talking about abstract ideas here. We're talking about real people with real lives, people whose futures are directly affected by all of this.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to a really interesting question that came up in one of the articles. What role should the international community play in making sure that if there is a peace agreement, it actually gets implemented? And maybe even more importantly, what can we do to prevent these kinds of conflicts from happening all over again?
Those are the big questions. It can't just be a one-time fix. We need to be thinking long-term. We need to be thinking about creating systems and structures that can actually, promote stability and cooperation in the region.
So it's not just about stopping this war, it's about building a real lasting peace. What would that even look like?
Well, imagine a post-conflict Ukraine rebuilt with the help of the international community, integrated into the European economy, a thriving democracy right on Russia's doorstep. It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this idea that peace isn't just about the absence of war. It's about creating the conditions where stability and prosperity can actually take root.
Yeah, exactly. And that means tackling the root causes of conflict.
Wow.
Things like poverty, inequality, political instability. You need a holistic approach that involves governments and civil society, international organizations, everyday citizens, everybody.
It's a huge undertaking.
It is.
But the potential rewards are just massive.
Yeah.
A more peaceful, more secure world for everyone.
And that's something worth fighting for, even if it's a long and difficult road.
Well, folks, that about wraps up our deep dive into the complexities of peace in Ukraine. We've explored the possibility of a negotiated settlement, the challenges facing this new administration, the incredibly complicated world of global politics, and we even took a look at some of the issues within U.S. foreign policy itself.
We covered a lot of ground. But as always, it's just the beginning. We really encourage you to keep learning about these issues, to question your own assumptions, and to have thoughtful conversations about how we can all work together to build a more peaceful future.
Absolutely. We've thrown a lot of information at you today, but the bottom line is this. Peace is possible, but it takes all of us working together. It takes a willingness to really grapple with complexity, to challenge ourselves, and to find solutions that benefit everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
As you go about your day, we want you to think about this. If peace does come to Ukraine, what can you do personally to make sure it's not just a temporary pause, but a lasting foundation for a brighter future?
A future we can all be proud of.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, ready to explore some more of the most interesting corners in the world. Until then, keep those minds curious.